Hello. Today we are going to talk about the economic perspectives on environmental problems. As you know, in social sciences we have other subjects, sociology, anthropology, political science, and economics. And you have already probably been exposed to certain ideas from the sociological and anthropological point of view of how they view the problems of the environment and the environment itself. Obviously, you know that economics is an extremely important aspect of everyday life, everyday activity, and everyday activities have significant impacts on the environment. So one would like to know what is the economic perspective and how does an economist look at the problems of the environment. And it's with this intention that we have this lecture today. But before I really start the slideshow for you to understand what I'm saying, I would just like to give you a couple of basics of what economics is all about and how we can take you from those basic ideas of economic theory into how we look at the problems of the environment from an economic point of view. So, economics is basically a science of scarcity. And when we talk about scarcity, it's not that we are talking about something which is rare. Scarcity is defined as something where the demand for that particular resource or activity or a product or a service is far in excess of its supply. So whenever we have excess demand for something, we say that resources are relatively scarce. And so therefore, we look at the subject matter of economics from the point of view of scarcity. We would make the assumption that all resources in the world are scarce because we have great use of them and there may not be enough of these resources to go around. So we'll say that the natural resources are scarce in nature. Then what does economics do? Well, economics is basically trying to address the question of how do we allocate these scarce resources that we have in the world among alternative uses and alternative ends. And therefore, economics can be looked upon as a science of choice where scarce resources are being allocated between alternative ends to fulfill certain wants of a particular society. And how do we go about understanding how to allocate these scarce resources? That's where economics has a role to play, and the theory of supply and demand and the price mechanism has a role to play. So let's get started with these basic concepts, and as we go along, I'll come back and explain or summarize whatever we have done. So now let's get started with our ideas, basic ideas of economic theory. Let's divide economic activity of a society into two broad divisions, and let's say one of them is consumption actions of people who go buy food, clothing, buy shelter, buy services, buy things for their final consumption, so that this becomes a final consumption good or a service that people indulge in. So people go shopping, people go hiring things for themselves, and so there's a demand for goods and services and things like that. So we put all that into a consumption activity. But of course, in order to consume, you must have something there and you have to produce that. And so the second division that we can make of all economic activity would be in terms of production. So productions of goods and services and the consumption of goods and services, broadly speaking, is a basic way of defining economic activity. Of course, you know that economic activity can be further subdivided into various other kinds of activities. For example, to us economists, everything that we do has an economic implication. So it's an economic activity. For example, you are now sitting and listening to this lecture, but by doing so, you have foregone some other alternative that you would have perhaps preferred to do. So in that sense, you have made an economic choice of coming and listening to this lecture. So everything, every choice that you make in your life has an economic implication, and that's how we look at economic activities. But To make matters simple, we have production and consumption activities as two very basic activities. Now let's look at production, for example. What do we mean by production? Production of goods and services require certain natural resources, require certain kinds of factors of production. So what are the factors of production? Again, basic economic theory makes a distinction between three major categories of factors of production. One of them is, of course, that we need land, we need labor, and the third is we need capital. The first, land, is a very important factor of production because we need land in order to use the facilities of a factory or an industry or to produce goods and services. And we also need land to grow food. We also need land to build a house. So therefore, land becomes a very important factor of production. The second thing that we need is labor power, our power, the human beings' activities in producing goods and services, and those would be constituting the labor component of the factors of production. But we don't do this all the time. Without capital, we can't do this. So what is capital? That capital has a very interesting connotation. Capital is actually a man-made means of production. That means capital is a produced means of production, whereas land is a natural gift of the nature that we have. Every country has its own limited levels of land and land masses. You can't really expand land, although in the olden days people were precisely doing that by colonizing or by invading other territories. So territorial acquisition was an important way of significantly expanding their land under them. But basically, we economists say that land is fixed in quantity given at any given point of time. Labor is, of course, the skills, the technology, the education, and all that goes up into the making of a skilled labor force in a country, and labor is generally measured in terms of either the number of people employed or even in terms of labor hours. The produced means of production, which is capital, is again produced by labor, and it is here that capital draws from the natural resource base of the globe, of the earth. For example, if you need gasoline, then it's a fossil fuel that has come from the earth. And similarly, if you need steel to produce something, this is a mineral that has been mined out of ore. So much of capital equipment and the metals that we use and the products that we produce and the chemicals are products of the earth. And this is where we impinge upon the natural resource environment of our country or the nation or the globe. Among alternative uses, obviously, land, labor, and capital are only means of production, and you can produce lots of goods and services with this. The point is, which of these goods and services does the society want, and by how much do they want, and how do we produce them? And it's in this sense that we are looking at how is this natural resource base of an economy allocating itself among the various alternative uses in the society. We have a very simple mechanism of this that we are going to present today. Well, you see, the consumption of goods and services means that goods and services are consumed by people because it fulfills certain wants. It fulfills certain desires of people. People want something. People want certain kinds of food. People want certain kinds of services. So this translates into what we would call demand. So there is a demand for goods and services, and this demand varies from societies to societies. Some people may have a demand for certain kinds of goods and services, whereas other societies may not. But certainly, demand is a very important aspect of the way in which production would be then based on, because it's through demand for goods and services that producers would be able to get an idea of what they can produce and sell. So the production of goods and services is the other side of the coin, and that will constitute what we will call the supply of goods and services and the consumption of goods and services. Now, would these always be exactly matching each other? Would always the demands of a society be exactly matched with the production activities? Well, that depends on what are the incentives for producers to produce these goods and services, and at what kind of economic incentive is created by this. Obviously, production of goods and services is expensive because it requires some sort of a cost, and if consumers are not willing to at least cover your costs of producing those goods and services, then a producer will not have an incentive to do so. Now, the ingenious mechanism that mainstream economics develops in order to get over this problem of matching consumption demand and the production of goods and services is through what we call the price. Price is the mechanism by which this demand and supply equilibriums are established in different markets. And when we look at the exchange of these goods and services, we call that exchange a marketplace. A market is a place, it's not necessarily a geographically defined place, but a market is an institution. A market is an institution that equates the demand and the supply of goods and services through the mechanism of the price. And that is called the market exchange institution, the institution of the market. But remember, this is not the market that's talked about in the news, stock market. No, that's not the market that we are talking about. We are talking about markets in general as an institution that equates demand and supply through the mechanism of price. Till very recently, when I say recently, maybe 100 years ago, I don't know really, economists were really only looking at how does price adjust to demand and supply conditions, and how do producers adjust supply to rising demand, falling demand, etc., etc., and how does money play a role in exercising this equilibrium. What was not really talked about was that every one of these activities that we are talking about, consumption, production, has an ancillary consequence. And that consequence of production and consumption is generally what we would call wastes. So production of goods and services also produces waste, and so does the consumption of goods and services. So the generation of waste itself is a byproduct of these activities of consumption and production. Now, as long as these wastes are of such quantity and quality that they do not directly affect consumption activities or incentives to consume, or production activities, the incentives to produce, economists were really not very much bothered about them. And it was treated as an exception that if the generation of these byproduct unintended consequences of consumption and production, if they were really having significant effects on consumption and production, then an economist would become alert to these problems, and usually we club them into a subset of problems called externalities. And that is where you have to understand this very carefully. The generation of wastes, of course, today, as you know, it can be of various kinds. You can have wastes from polluting factories, you can have wastes of which are biodegradable in nature, you can have wastes which are not biodegradable in nature, and you can have wastes in water or land, or you can also have another problem of the extraction of natural resources for production, which is called depletion. So you can have the depletion of forests, you can have the depletion of water bodies, you can have depletion of groundwater, you can have depletion of fossil fuels. So all these add to the problems of the environment, which were hitherto not really taken into account in the normal production and consumption cycles that were analyzed. So today, when we talk about the economic perspective of environmental problems, I would say it in one sentence. It is to analyze the economic consequences of returning waste to the natural environment. So now we are recognizing the fact that when we generate wastes and return it back to the environment, this also now would have an economic consequence. And to analyze, to minimize, or to try to manage this economic consequence of returning waste to the environment is exactly the problem of environmental economics. And that's what we're going to be looking at in some detail later on. One thing is important for you to remember is that much of this environmental concern for the impact of wastes and the generation of waste on human activity is essentially only looking at the impact on human beings themselves. So in that sense, we say the perspective on the economic perspective on environment is essentially anthropocentric. It's anthropocentric, which distinguishes it from the other kinds of perspectives that you would perhaps be encountering in this course, which is, for example, the ecological perspective on the environment. The ecological perspective expands this idea of consequences of returning waste to the environment or the consequences of depletion to other species of animals and plants and biodiversity and any other living organism. So they are worried about the habitats, they are worried about the consequence of some animals being driven to extinction, so they are worried about certain loss of biodiversity. Now, basically, these are effects if they have significant consequences on economic activity and economic incentives, then it becomes a part of environmental economics. But if for example, the production of a coal electricity generation plant, if it is situated in a place where some rare species of an animal or a plant is going to be deprived of its habitat, it would not be a concern for an environmental economist unless it can be very clearly shown that this has very bad consequences for human activity and human behavior and the future of human beings themselves. So in that sense, the anthropocentric view is basically a view where we are looking at the generation of wastes and the economic consequences on human beings and health, etc., that kind of thing. So what we're going to do is look at this process in a little more detail. What is the environment economic interaction? Well, I can put it in this very interesting simple slide where we can have the environment as this big blue oval which encompasses everything, and it's a subset of this in the environment that the economic system works, and within the economic system you have the production and consumption activities, but production takes away from the environment and consumption, and this taking away from the environment could result in things like depletion. Consumption activities also generate wastes, so you can have degradation, you can have pollution, and this can also lead to other environmental consequences. Global warming, ozone depletion, loss of habitat, loss of biodiversity, as I said. And remember that even production activity could significantly contribute to these degradation and pollution. So if you notice that we have depletion, we have degradation, and we have pollution. So there are these three problems that we deal with when we look at the economic perspectives on the environment. And it is with respect to these three problems that an economist is trying to find solutions. He is trying to find economic solutions. He is trying to find solutions which will incentivize people to behave in ways in which depletion is converted into sustainable use, where degradation is minimized, and where pollution can be controlled. So it is in this sense that the economist is trying to devise solutions. Now, how do you go about doing this? It's a very interesting question because, as you know, that an economist is only worried about supply and demand and the price, and he thinks that the market will somehow equilibrate the demand for goods and services and the price. And this equilibrating mechanism also allocates the resources. The interesting part of it is, if suppose the demand for a certain good or services falls. If that happens, then the willingness to pay for a good and service falls with the falling demand, because people are not willing to buy this good and service anymore. For various reasons, they may not be wanting this anymore. There could be changes in tastes and preferences. There could be changes in income levels. There are lots of other factors. But what does that do? That means that it gives a signal to the producers that this line of business or this line of production or this line of service is no longer going to be profitable for them, for they will not be able to cover their costs with the kind of prices that consumers are willing to pay for these products or services. What does that do? In turn, that would mean that capital, labor, and other natural resources will be moving out of this line of production into other lines of production where there are higher demands and higher prices to be paid. So in some sense, the reallocation happens automatically. Capital only flows into those channels where it is profitable to do so, and so does labor and land, but that is driven by the demand. So it is in this fashion that the market mechanism, the price, directs rather invisibly people's activities, and in doing so, it directs the allocation of resources between different economic activities. I hope you understood the logic of this. But now, if suppose we do not have a price, suppose we have goods and services which cannot be priced or which cannot be calculated in value, then they are into problems, because then we do not have this equilibrating market which can allocate resources between the alternative ends in a most optimal way. It is in this sense that we bring in the problems of the environment. So let's start off with the idea of the classification of goods. Can we have free goods? There's a saying that there are no free lunches in the world. But can we have free goods? Yes, we can have free goods. What are free goods? Well, one of the ways in which you can look at free goods is because if it is available in great quantities, there's a relative abundance of this good, and therefore, and its supply is far in excess of the demand for it. Can you think of something like this, which is so freely available and whose supply is far in excess of its demand for it? If you think a little, maybe it's very close to us, it's all around us, it's air. Because we really don't pay to breathe, do we? And your breathing the air does not deprive me of breathing air. So there's a lot of air around us. So air could be considered to be a free good because its supply is far in excess of demand and it has hardly any costs of production. However, can air always remain a free good is a question that we would like to ask today. Well, I could say that air may be a free good, but clean air may not be a free good. Because if you are living, let's say, in a polluted environment and you want clean air as a good for you to breathe, now you will have to expend some costs in order to acquire that clean air. One of the things you could do is perhaps put a mask, and if things get even worse, you could put filters in your air conditioning systems, or you can put filters in your room. And if things get even worse, then you'll carry your clean air with you in a tank with a mask. So if that happens, you can see that it may not remain a free good. So we may have to work, as this man is working, he has to work for clean air. So therefore, understand the fact that something which may have been a free good earlier may cease to be so later on. Similarly, air is a scarce good at the bottom of the ocean because you cannot breathe underwater, so you need air tanks, and they are limited in supply, and then you have to take these air tanks. So therefore, you can see that air by itself we can say is a free good because it's naturally available in the environment, but maybe clean air may not be such a free good after all in the times to come. Let's hope that doesn't happen. Then you can have private goods. What are private goods? Well, private goods are very easy to understand. They are costly to produce and they are scarce and they're exchanged on the market for a given price. And what can be such examples? Oh, everything that we buy and sell on the market are usually private goods. One of the important aspects, whether I have, yes, I mentioned it in my slideshow, is why do we call it private? What is this private, the word private? The word private denotes a connotation of rights, that you have certain kinds of ownership rights over that good. So therefore, if I buy a car, that car belongs to me, which means that another person cannot take away this car from me, and if he does, he can be punishable by law for having done so. He can be a thief. So therefore, ownership becomes a very important aspect of goods. These goods are scarce, they are costly to produce, but they are available on the market at given prices, but ownership becomes very important. And what do we mean by private ownership? Means we could exclude others from the use of this good. For example, if I have my car, others will not be able to use it unless they take my consent. So I have the power of deciding who can use or may not use this good. You may have goods which you will not ever allow others to use, and it's completely your own private good. For example, usually you don't allow people to wear your clothes. Your clothes are your clothes, your shoes for that matter. Correct? So there are certain goods which are completely private, and you will exclude people from this. The third aspect of private goods is alienation. Alienation means you have the right to dispose this off, sell it to somebody else, gift it to somebody else, or transfer it to somebody else, and that right, you have that right to do so, and you can do so or you could exclude people. So these are important aspects, and the last but not the least aspect of a private good is that it is rival in nature. What do we mean by rival in nature? Well, when we say it's scarce, itself means it's rival in nature. That is to say that my use of this good leaves less of it available for others. So therefore, if I go and buy a certain quantity of, let's say, potatoes in the market, well, that quantity of potatoes is not available to others. So therefore, the quantity of potatoes gets depleted as more and more people buy these potatoes, unless the supply cap keeps up. This depletion of potatoes, where the demand may be larger than supply, can change the prices. So therefore, it's rival in nature. That means that my use of this excludes others from its use. Most of all commodities and services come under the idea of private goods. So if I hire a taxi, then that taxi is hired by me and nobody else can use it when I'm using the taxi. So it's a private good, and I have paid for it, and it's scarce, and then it's costly to deliver as a service because it uses a car and gasoline. So therefore, it's a private good. And similarly, commodities, consumption goods are private goods. So therefore, these are all examples. Most goods on the market are private goods. Now there's another category of goods. Instead of the word private, we have something called public goods. Now, what are public goods? It's important to understand this concept a little more carefully. One of the ideas is that unlike free goods, it is costly to produce these goods and services. So they're not available to us simply because they're there, but they need to be produced by human activity of production. So it's costly to produce, but it cannot exclude anybody from the use of this good, unlike a private good. So can you think of something that we would like the society to have, but then once you have it, everybody can use it? And it's non-excludable in that sense, which also means that there are no private property rights over this good. And it is non-rival. Non-rival in the sense that the use of my use of it does not leave less of it available for somebody else. Like air. Unlike air, this is costly to produce. So there's a difference between the free good air and this public good that we're talking about. I've not given you an example of such a good yet, but I suppose you can get my drift, what kind of examples that I could generate. But one question one could ask is, suppose I produce a good, and once I produce this good by my own effort and cost, it's available to others freely. in the sense that they don't have to pay for this good in some sense, directly. Would I ever like to do something like that? Well, if I'm a large-hearted philanthropist and who likes to do things for people just for the sake of doing it, I would do it. But most private individuals do not produce such goods. They produce goods for their own consumption or for others' consumption, for a profit or for a benefit which accrues to them and them alone. Now, therefore, if that is true, left to private individuals, the incentives to produce such goods will be suboptimal. I mean, in the sense, it will be undersupplied by the market. Now, I don't know whether this is a very clear concept. There is no incentive for private, if the market for, let me go back to the idea of the market. Remember, it's an interaction between producers and consumers. These are private individuals. Each of these individuals has a particular behavioral assumption which is hidden, which I have not really spelt out in this class, but now I will do so. Each seeks his own self-interested maximizing of satisfaction or utility or want, whatever it is. In the similar way, a producer is trying to maximize his profits. If we impose these behavioral assumptions on these groups of consumers and producers and allow them to interact in a market for prices, then the demand for a good and service by a consumer is also called the willingness to pay price for that good or service. Similarly, the supply curve or the supply of goods and services would be based upon his costs of production and the effort that he has put in, and to see whether he can get a price on the market which will cover his costs of production and more perhaps to make a profit. Unless he foresees such a price in the market at which it can be sold, he will not have the incentive to produce it. Now, the idea here is each of them is pursuing their own private interests. And the consumer and the producer, in pursuing this own private interests, if they agree upon a price at which a consumer is willing to pay and a producer is willing to sell, that price at which the demand and supply are equal is called a market clearing price, and that price is also called an efficient price. Now, any other price other than this would lead to either excess demand or excess supply in the market, and the markets don't clear. And if that happens, then we say the market is oversupplying or undersupplying a certain kind of good and service. But the problem is solved in the price mechanism, because they say then the prices will change. If there is excess demand for a good and service, the prices will rise. And when the prices rise, there will be an incentive to producers to make more profits, so they will supply more. And in that sense, the supply and demand can again get equalized. Similarly, if there is excess supply in the market and the demand for that good is not forthcoming, the suppliers would like to offload it at lower prices because they want to clear. They don't want to hold stocks. They don't want to hold inventories, especially if they are perishables. So therefore, the price in the system is automatically regulating the demand and supply of goods and services in the market. But when it comes to public goods such as these, where there are no private property rights, remember that when a producer produces this good which is exchanged on the market at that price, the profit that he gets is his own. It's not going to somebody else. So it's a private benefit that he derives. Similarly, the consumer, when he buys this good, he has ownership of that good and he has private property rights over that good, and so therefore the benefits accrue to him and him alone, unless he wants to transfer it or gift it to others or sell it later on in the market. But suppose you have a good which once you acquire it, everybody else can also use it. Then you feel this is not very just. You feel that I've worked for this good, I have to produce this good. Why should others benefit without having to have worked for it or pay for it? So therefore,
if such goods exist where you cannot really exclude people, now why is it that you can't exclude people? We can come to that in a little while. But if you cannot exclude people, then the private incentives for producers to produce such goods does not exist. And it is in that sense we say public goods are undersupplied by the market. Remember, a non-excludability of a public good is where no private property rights exist. So if there are no private property rights existing on this, it's nobody's property, it's everybody's property. And it can result in an overuse by private parties if it's accruing a benefit to them, or private parties may also underinvest in such goods. So they really are not interested in the upkeep of such goods. But if it's available to them, they will use it and extract out of it. Now, one of the important aspects is that if that happens, that private individuals are going to behave in this fashion, then a third party intervention may be necessary in order to undertake the provision of such goods. And therefore, now you can see this photograph tells you two things. It shows you an open road, and it also shows you that the road is lit by street lights. Now let's go back to the idea of a public good. What did we say a public good was? You cannot exclude anybody from its use, which means, yes, can you exclude somebody from benefiting from the light that is being emanated in this road? No. Now, if you stand under the street light, it doesn't mean that the street light is not going to be shining for others. So therefore, you can't really exclude the benefit of standing under a street light from others. Similarly, the road, but there you may say, well, if we were 100 million people on that road, then we probably will be pushing and pulling at each other. True, but otherwise, the road is there for everybody. It's not just for a private party, it's there for everybody. It's provided by the government, but you think that it's not, you know that it's costly to produce. So are you paying for the road? Well, in a way you are. You are paying for the road in a very, very indirect manner. Taxes, correct? Taxes that you pay to the government. Many of our developing countries do not understand this relationship, that it is your money that is being used to produce these public goods. When you say it's government, it's a government-owned thing, you think that it is nothing to do with you. But in fact, you have indirectly paid for it. Okay, let's get on with these ideas. Now look at that second slide. It's a lovely little park where you have benches for people to sit on, and you have trees under which you can sit. And probably these parks, these public parks as they are called, have some characteristics of public goods that we are talking about. A third one, yes, bridges. Why would any private individual build a bridge between two land masses if everybody can use it? So our government again steps in and produces these bridges. But I'm asking a question now, that if this is true, then let's look at our RTC bus services, the Road Transport Corporation bus services that exist in cities. Is that a public good? Many people make the mistake of thinking that it is a public good. But if you think carefully in terms of our definition of public goods, well, let's go back to the definition. Definition of a public good is costly to produce. Is road transport costly to produce? Yes, of course. Cannot exclude anybody from its use. Yes, you cannot exclude anybody from its use. If they are wanting to travel by this transport, you can't, unlike a private car or something like that. But is it non-rival? Is it really non-rival? Well, if I get into an RTC bus and I buy a ticket and sit in a seat, then there's less number of seats available to others. So therefore, it's not non-rival. It is rival. So it's not as if the moment you sit on a seat, magically another empty seat appears so that the supply of seats continuously increases no matter how many people get in. That doesn't happen, correct? So therefore, it's not non-rival, means it's rival in use, right? Therefore, it has certain characteristics of public goods, but it is not a public good. It is in fact a private good, but it is true that governments usually undertake the provision of such goods. So therefore, I would say the bus services is not a public good. The reason for the confusion is the word public. The word public, as we are using it in this lecture, is the economic idea of what is a public good. It's public does not mean government, although many kinds of public goods are produced by government. Not all goods produced by the government are public goods. So therefore, please remember, when we say public, we are not talking about government provided goods. Whereas a normal notion in everyday life is, ye to public property hai. Public property means what? They basically say government owned property. But that's not the definition of a public good. For example, some of these goods can be destroyed by the nature of the amount of people using it. For example, look at that. The road that is provided by the government is hardly adequate for people to really use it in a very beneficial fashion. Now it becomes rival because people vie to go on the road. There are traffic jams. People are angry with others, and the use of you on the road excludes others from the road. So these are usually not called pure public goods. They are called impure public goods. What can there ever exist? A pure public good? Yes. The most common example of a pure public good is the national defense of a country. All those people who are defending our borders. The national defense, which is protecting the integrity of this country or from attacks from outside or from within. And this nature of this good or service that is being provided, you can see it's costly to produce, and it is non-excludable. Everybody within the country enjoys the security that is provided by this good. It is non-rival. If the population of the nation increases, it doesn't mean less of the security is available to others, correct? So it has all the three characteristics of a public good, and of course it's being provided by the government. That's beside the point. The point is that it has these three non-rival, non-excludable, and expensive to produce three characteristics which makes it a pure public good. And so national defense can be looked upon as a pure public good. As we know, earlier we have said mostly private goods are exchanged on the market. But you see, public goods such as street lights, national defense, roads, bridges cannot be exchanged on the market by definition. You could convert an impure public good into a public good. For example, if you go back to our bridge, this, although maybe have provided by the government, could become a private good which can be exchanged on the market. All you need to do is create a toll on either side, so people will now have to pay a price to use this bridge. It no longer remains a public good in the sense of an economic term, but it is still maybe owned by the government. Understand? Just like the RTC bus. The RTC buses are provided by the government, but then you have to pay for use of this. Every time you travel on it, you need to buy a ticket, correct? It's not a freely available service that is there. So similarly, some goods can be converted into public goods, but you will see that the kind of goods that we are going to talk about in our economic lecture, it's very difficult to convert them into private goods anyway. But why is it that public goods cannot be exchanged on the market? I'm unfortunately giving you the answer in some sense, but think about what do we mean by not being able to exchange on the market. One of the important reasons is that the property rights of ownership and use are not defined over public goods. We cannot really define who can use, because everybody can use it, and who's the owner of this public good. Government is not a private entity which can be defined very easily. Government is you and me, as well as the people in in the parliament and in the House of Commons and other things. But that's not ownership. The ownership rights are very ill-defined in such cases, and therefore markets don't exist for such goods, which also means that market mechanisms work only when private property rights are fully and well defined. So whenever you find that it's difficult to define the property rights over a good or a resource or a service, then you will have problems of trying to exchange this on a market for a given price. Whenever that happens, we say that market failure occurs, and therefore non-excludability, that all have access to it and the use of one does not leave less of the other, the non-rival. In such cases, markets do not function for such goods, and we say the markets fail. And this is an aspect of market failure. This concept of market failure is crucial in understanding the problems of the environment. As you will see, let us look at some of these pictures that I'm going to put up here. Look at the public nature of the environment. For example, who owns the oceans, and who owns the forests, and who owns the animals and the wildlife? So all such areas are open access to all because of the public nature, correct? And that leads to hunting, overhunting, maybe depletion of timber and all other kinds of problems. So therefore, what we are trying to say is that the three main problems in environmental economics is the problem of pollution, is the problem of depletion, and the problem of degradation. And because of the public nature of these goods and services of the environment, there do not exist markets to check and balance these with some prices, and we have to then look at how to change the incentives of economic agents to stop the three consequences. That is the subject matter of environmental economics. In the coming lectures, in the forthcoming lectures, you will actually go into the theory of public goods and the theory of externalities in order to better understand how these incentives can be created. Thank you.